Hi guys, it's Miss Hall here, and today we're going to talk about another important event that happened during the Renaissance, and that is the Protestant Reformation. We're going to talk today a little about the Protestant Reformation, and I hope that by the time you finish this video, you will, of course, be able to understand what the Reformation was, but also understand some of the causes of it and some of the important leaders and what their role was in the Reformation. So the first thing you need to understand is what was the Protestant Reformation. And the Reformation happened in the 16th century. It was a religious movement that was characterized by the rejection of the Roman Catholic beliefs and practices. Remember, Roman Catholicism had been the religion for most of Europe since the ancient times. And this Reformation was the first real rejection of that and the establishment of the Protestant churches. We get the word Protestant because the Protestants were those who protested the Roman Catholic ideas. Now, you might be asking yourself, what were some of the causes of the Reformation? And there are really quite a few. First, there were some political causes. Remember that Europe is being divided up into nation states, and with these nation states came monarchs. Each nation state had their own monarch. And these monarchs began to have some conflict with the principle of religious supremacy. They started to view the Pope as a foreign ruler in Italy who was a rival for their power in their own nation states. There were also economic causes to the Protestant Reformation. These same monarchs that felt their power was being threatened also felt that their wallets were being threatened. They were jealous of the great wealth and the land that the church owned and acquired. And the religious rules frequently limited their economic growth and that of the middle class. And at this time, there was a developing middle class, and they wanted approval for their accumulation of wealth. They wanted it to be okay that they were earning money, and they did not want to have to give large portions of what they were earning to the church. There were also a lot of intellectual causes for the Reformation. Remember, we've talked about humanism and individualism, and because of this, people wanted to be able to have a more personal relationship with God. They didn't want to have saints and the Pope and other religious figures approaching God on their behalf. They wanted to be able to do it themselves. Rationalism and humanism actually encouraged a questioning attitude and challenging authority like the church. And as secularism increased and nationalistic attitudes became strong, people began to be more loyal to their monarch than to the Pope, and all of those helped with the Reformation. Perhaps the most significant causes of the Reformation were the religious causes. The church began to become less popular, and they began to be criticized for a lot of inappropriate practices, like nepotism, which is showing favoritism to your family and people in your family getting positions over people that actually deserved them. Absenteeism was this idea that the religious leaders really were not there a lot of the time. Of course, there was ignorance and immorality. The sale of indulgences is perhaps the most highly criticized practice of the early church. And this is the idea that in order to get forgiveness for your sin, you had to pay money to the church. And that's perhaps one of the most significant criticisms of the early church. There were, of course, earlier attempts to reform the church, but they largely failed, and many began to think that a true separation was the only way that change was going to happen. As Mr. Drake talked about in the last video, the printing press was a huge invention that happened during the Renaissance, and it was also very important to the Reformation. Because of the printing press, these new ideas were able to spread very rapidly. We're going to talk in just a minute about Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, and copies of this were printed and sent all over, and that really helped the ideas of the Reformation spread quickly. The next thing I want to talk about are some of the important leaders of the Reformation and their role. In about 1176 AD, there was a wealthy merchant living in Lyon, France, and he began to question the ways of the Catholic Church. His name was Peter Waldo. Waldo eventually ended up selling all of his belongings and dedicating his life to teaching the gospel, and he gained a lot of followers. They called themselves the Poor of Lyon, and they ended up being excommunicated from the Catholic Church. By about 1181 AD, they were all excommunicated. They faced a lot of persecution. In 1211 AD, more than 50 of them ended up being burned at the stake. This ill treatment of them, rather than discouraging other reformers, actually served to fuel their fire and to encourage them. Another important reformer, probably the most well-known, was a man named Martin Luther. And on a afternoon, he got caught out in a thunderstorm, and he was nearly struck by lightning, and he felt that this was really a sign from God. He had been in law school, but was unhappy, and he decided that he needed to give up law school and become a monk. And so after the storm, he decided to join a monastery in Germany, and he began to dedicate his life to learning and teaching the gospel. And the more he studied, the more he felt that the Catholic Church had ventured far away from what the gospel preached, and he collected a list of 95 different points of doctrine where he felt the church was incorrect. On October 31st, 1517, Martin wrote these 95 points on a placard, and he nailed it to the door of the Catholic Church in Wittenberg, Germany. And the 95 points were also copied and sent throughout Germany. And this resulted in the Catholic Church losing out on the collection of a lot of money that should have been collected in exchange for indulgences. The sale of indulgences, which I mentioned a minute ago, was one of the 95 practices that he disagreed with. And as the money from the sale of indulgences began to greatly decline, Pope Leo X was very upset, and he sent people to Martin and attempted to get him to take back his disagreement, but he refused, stating that he had an obligation to God to do what he felt was right. In 1520, the Catholic Church had had enough, and they declared that Martin was a heretic, which was a crime punishable by death. But Martin actually managed to escape, and he continued to work on reforming, having the Bible translated into German so more of the people could read it, and ended up founding a religion that we know today as Lutheranism. As Lutheranism gained influence in Germany, religious leaders in the neighboring country of Switzerland began a reformation of their own. Like Martin Luther, these leaders felt that the Catholic Church had grown corrupt, but unlike Luther, they really wanted to establish a religious theocracy, or a government based on their religion, so that they could rule the lives of their people and ensure that they were keeping the commandments of God. One of the first of these leaders was a man named Huldreich Zwingli, and Zwingli established his theocracy in the city of Zurich and was actually very successful. He ruled the city for 6 years, but in 1531, a Catholic army of 8,000 soldiers came and conquered and overthrew Zwingli. In the mid-1500s, another religious leader by the name of John Calvin began working to bring about reform in the Catholic Church. Like Zwingli, Calvin lived in Switzerland, and he wanted to set up a theocracy. By 1541, Calvin had managed to set up his theocracy in Geneva. The city government forced all citizens to attend church several times a week and had very strict rules about what people could and could not do. John Calvin wrote a book which he called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. This book became quite popular in his day and would become very influential among future reformers. Calvin's most important teaching was that mankind could not be controlled or could not control or could not change anything in this life. Calvin believed that everything was controlled by God, the past, the present, and the future. He called this doctrine predestination, and according to this doctrine, certain people were predestined to go to heaven or to go to hell, and it did not matter what they did in this life. As the Calvinists worked to ensure that people practiced the religious teachings that were required by law, they were actually somewhat violent. They put many people to death for lots of crimes against the church, such as witchcraft or being too Catholic. So, those are most of the important leaders in the first part of the Protestant Reformation. Up next, we're going to talk about the Reformation in England and how it took on sort of a different approach thanks to Henry VIII and his development of the Church of England. You'll learn about that a little bit later. Make sure you go back and review this video and are ready for your quiz.